I'm reading from Matthew chapter 25, and Yeshua is talking about at the judgment day, at the end when everybody has been resurrected and we're all standing before the throne of God. He has separated the righteous from the wicked. And he turns to the righteous and he says, "Come you, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." And the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the king will answer and say to them, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me." And then he turns to the wicked, and he says, "Get out of my sight, because you didn't do these things. You didn't feed the hungry. You didn't welcome the stranger. You didn't visit the sick. And I guarantee you that many of those wicked people have done exactly that. They have visited the sick. They have done good things for lots of people. That's not enough to get them into God's presence. That's not enough to pass that bar of salvation. So what is the difference? What really marks the difference between the sheep and the goats, the believers and the unbelievers? Now, clearly, there is one difference in the things that they do. Yeshua really meant it when he said that these are the things that God values. He values how you treat widows, orphans, the people who don't have the means to provide for themselves. He values how you treat the sojourner, the person without an inheritance among you, or the person who's just traveling through. He wants you to take care of these people, and that really matters. But there are a couple of other things. Probably the most important thing that's going to separate the righteous from the wicked is that the righteous trust in God's promises. Although Abraham, he defended the weak, he welcomed visitors, he was a generous man, but the thing that really set him apart, that made him God's friend, was his faith. He believed God's promises and he acted on them. He knew that God had promised that Isaac would be the father of nations. So when God said, "Take your son Isaac up to this mountain and kill him," Abraham knew that that wasn't going to be the end. He knew that either God was going to intervene or God was going to resurrect him. Something was going to happen to ensure that God's promises were fulfilled. Because he believed God when he made him a promise. So trust in God's promises is the number one mark of God's sheep. Second one, keep the commandments. As Solomon said when he closed out the book of Ecclesiastes, this is the whole duty of man. Fear God and keep his commandments. God spent a lot of time, a lot of ink, telling us what he wants from us, how he wants us to live. And all of these things that Yeshua talks about here, treatment of widows and orphans, the poor, the sick, the sojourners, these are all included in God's commandments. And the essence of all of God's commandments is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul, with all your power. How do you do that? You do that by loving the people who bear his image. You do that by keeping his commandments. You do that by trusting his word. If you trust God's word, if you trust the words of Yeshua, you will do what he says. You will keep his commandments. And that's more than just the ones where you are kind and generous to your neighbor, although those are vital. It's also, how do you treat God's image in yourself? Do you indulge in behaviors that God said are disgusting? Do you put things into your body? Do you eat things that God said is disgusting? Now, not understanding God's commandments, not living up to them all the time, these things aren't going to condemn you to hell. But rejecting them, just outright rejecting God's commandments, that will. Because if you reject God's commandments, you don't really trust God. You don't have faith. If you have faith, if you really believe God's promises, you will act on them. You're going to obey his commandments, and you are going to do these things. This isn't a menu. This isn't where you get to pick one. God, it's okay. I fed the hungry, and I went to the hospital and visited sick people, so I'm in, right? No. Those are great, but that's not enough. Were you an idolater? Did you reject Yeshua as the Messiah? Did you live as an unrepentant homosexual? Those things are part of God's commandments too. You can't just pick and choose which of God's commandments you're going to keep. If you are God's people, if you are one of the sheep rather than the goats at this judgment day, this is how you're going to live. In these things, how you treat the widows and the orphans, the poor, the sick, the sojourner. This is the first bar. If you can't get past this, it doesn't matter what you're eating or how else you're living. If you're not good to other people, how can you really say that you love God if you don't love the people who bear his image and are suffering in this world? And I can't honestly say that that's really an easy thing to do, because a lot of these people that he's talking about here, a lot of the suffering and the weak or the ill, the people who can't take care of themselves, they can be very difficult to love and to care for. But God didn't say, Yeshua here didn't say, you took in the strangers who were good company, who were good conversationalists. He didn't say you visited the sick who, were nice to you or who didn't smell bad. That's even the ones who smell bad, even the ones who are rude, who are awkward, they still bear God's image too. And they need you maybe even more than those other people do. And it's a hard thing. I can't really say that I've been great at that. I've tried, and it's a really uncomfortable, difficult thing. But it's something we have to do. Start in your own community. Do you know people who need help? I mean, you don't have to go out and find every sick person and every poor person and help them. You can't fix the whole world. That's God's problem. But you can get to know your neighbors. You can say, the widow next door is sick and she needs help getting to the hospital. Maybe she just needs some company, somebody to talk to. Maybe there's a minister coming through town who's teaching at your fellowship. Maybe he needs a place to stay. Maybe you've got a spare room. That'd be better than a hotel. Maybe, depends on what kind of conversationalist and how awkward you are, I suppose. But there are things that you can do in your own community, and I think that's the most important place to start. Keep the commandments in your own life. Reach out to the people in your own community who need help or are suffering, because we all bear the image of God. And if you can't respect that, I don't see how God's going to respect you at the judgment day. This is Jake Harper from American Torah. Be blessed.